Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to be getting our hands dirty in the sense that we'll be actually taking a look at how to identify and exploit local file inclusion vulnerabilities, and more so I'll be using this practical demonstration as a way to explain the difference in addition to what I mentioned we'll be covering a couple of seconds ago. I'll be using it to demonstrate the difference between local file inclusion vulnerabilities and directory traversal vulnerabilities. So as I pointed out, this video will be utilizing a live lab, and this particular lab in question is going to be using BWAP, the deliberately vulnerable web application. So again, I like using it because it allows me to show you how everything works. And this particular lab will also provide you with a Kali Linux system, so you do not need to utilize your own system in this case. Just fire up the lab and you'll be provided with a Kali box from which we can pretty much get started. So what I'm going to do is fire up the lab and I'll see you in there, and hopefully you're as excited as I am to dive into local file inclusion. So I'll see you there. All right, I am back within the lab environment, and as I mentioned earlier, you'll be provided with access to a pre-configured Kali Linux system that you can access through your browser. The first order of business is going to be identifying the IP address of the target web application, which we've done before. Very, very simple. Just open up your terminal, and I'm going to do that right now. What we want to do is type in the command ifconfig, right? And that'll provide you with the IP address of your Kali Linux system, and the network interface in question that we want to pay attention to is Ethernet 1. So in your case, the IP address of your Kali Linux system will be different. All right, the subnet will be different, but what will remain the same is the fact that the Kali Linux system will be on the second IP within that subnet, whatever that subnet may be. Now, what the way the actual labs are configured is that the target web application is running on the third IP address within the subnet. So in reality, your IP value will be different here. You just need to copy this value and change the 2 to a 3 at the end here, and that's the IP address of the target web application. So now that we know that, I'm going to open up my browser, which is Firefox here. And what I'm going to do now is just maximize that. I'm going to paste in the IP I copied and change it to a 3, and you can see that'll take you to BWAP. All right, so this is the deliberately vulnerable web application which we've explored previously in this course. So we are going to just type in B and bug. Okay, and I'm going to log in, and that'll take us to the portal where we can specify the vulnerabilities that we want to play around with. Now, I know you're excited to get started with local file inclusion, but before we do that, I really want to revisit directory traversal one more time. And the reason for that will become apparent. So if I go into directory traversal files under A7, missing functional level access control, and I click on hack, that'll take us to this particular page with a parameter called page that is equal to message.txt. And as I pointed out, the primary difference between the two, directory traversal and local file inclusion, is the objective. So we took a look at an example where we utilized the traversal sequence right over here to take us to the root of the file system. And then, of course, we were able to access a particular file like, etc password, for example. There we are. Okay, no problem with that. Now, let's say I'm going to go back into bugs, all right? And I'm going to go into A7 one more time and click on directory traversal directories. The reason I'm doing this will become apparent, all right? And I will perform the traversal now. I'll just go to the root right over here. I think 4 should be enough, but we'll just go with 5 to stay safe. And we'll go var www HTML. I just want to see what's stored within this directory. So right, I hit enter, and you can see we have PHP info. I click on that, it says, okay, that's not found, no problem. But now what I can do is I'll just take note of this here. I'll just copy that traversal sequence, if you will, and I'll go back to bugs. And for some reason, Firefox keeps crashing on that particular page, which is very strange. Or let me restore that tab. Can I go back to bugs, please? Okay, keeps crashing. I think there's a lot of data being loaded there, but let me go back home. Can I go back home? Let's see. We'll go to just the root of the actual web server. There we are. Close tab. Let's just open it up afresh. So I'll just copy the IP again here. So that's 192.168.157.3. 192.181.57.3. There we are. And we'll now go back to A7 and we'll click on directory traversal files. Okay. And I'm just going to change this to, well, I thought I'd copied it, but we can say var www HTML. We would need to obviously put in the traversal sequence, which I've forgotten to do, but I will do that nonetheless. 2, and we'll go 3 steps, 4 steps, and 5 steps, which we know works. And then we'll say, for example, php info.php. Okay, so pay attention. Based on the description I gave you in the previous video and what we discussed in the directory traversal section, this allows me to read these resources, which is not a problem. But remember, this is still a PHP file, okay? And that's where inclusion comes into play. So the best way to demonstrate the difference is to just go to A7, all right? And now we're finally taking a look at local file inclusion. So you want to click on the vulnerability called remote and local file inclusion, okay? So we'll click on that and we can see it works really simply. This page, we have a language selection drop-down menu here and we click on English and you can see it says, thank you for your interest in BWAP. Now pay attention at or to the actual URL parameters. So we have an action parameter which is equal to go. We don't want to play around with that. What we want to play around with is the language parameter value, which is equal to language english.php. So now I don't know what directory I'm in here. So what that means is I really should be using some traversal sequences to go to the root of the file system, then go into var www HTML, and then specify a PHP file, okay? But let's take a very simple example of a PHP file that is relevant to this web application. So let's say something like login.php. Now, what do you think is going to happen? Again, think of it from the perspective of directory traversal. If we try to do that, what do you think is going to happen here? Well, what's going to happen is that this particular login.php script, if it does exist, will be included on this page. So I'll hit enter. And what do we have here? This is very interesting. So instead of displaying the content of the PHP file, it includes the login.php file within this page. And if you again revisit the previous video's description of inclusion, it's primarily used by web application developers to include, to create dynamic pages. And you can see why. So it allows you to include a PHP script in this particular case. And the only way it includes it is by executing it. And the only way it can be executed is if the web server supports the execution or can execute a PHP script, which in this case it can. Okay, so the bottom line is, let's see if we can access it from this directory. So php info.php. I hit enter. And remember, previously, when we tried to access the very same file, it displayed the content of the php info.php file. It did not render it, or it did not get the web server to execute the PHP file and render it as it should have been rendered. And the difference is that in this case, it is included in the context of the web application. So that is pretty much what local file inclusion is all about. And more so, this is the difference between directory traversal and local file inclusion. Now, I mentioned in the previous video that you can utilize directory traversal techniques to facilitate local file inclusion, even really local file inclusion, because it wouldn't make sense that directory traversal would facilitate remote file inclusion. But for the purposes of this demonstration, The point is that I could say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and say var www HTML. And again, I don't know if this will work, but let's hit enter. And for some reason that crashed. Interesting. Let's restore that session. Okay, we need to log in again, but let's try it here. So bug. There we go. Just to show you the difference one more time. Again, I hate to be repetitive, but I just want to show you. So we'll click on directory traversal, and I'll just show you same file. So we'll use the sequence here, 1, 2, and we'll just click on var www html php info.php. You can see instead of rendering this as it should have been rendered, it just displays this stuff here. So it calls for php info, which means it's not executing. This PHP code is not being executed. That would display, the PHP info. We go back to bugs, and we click, go back to A7 here, and we click on remote and local file inclusion. We can utilize, as I pointed out, we can utilize traversal techniques, hopefully if the browser doesn't fail, but we can utilize traversal techniques to access a particular file that we would want to include as long as it's locally stored. Now, does this mean that inclusion will always execute a file? No, it means what file inclusion means that if it is executable, it will be executable or it will be included. If I specify a text file, the text file will be displayed because the text file is not executable. Case in point, let us replace this here with something like etc password. And there you go. Because that file is not executable, it just includes it or the content of the file. And the same goes for something like, we say etc apache 2, apache2.conf. We hit enter. You can see it just displays the content of the file and does not actually display it in a formatted way. It pretty much just includes it within the context of the web application. So this is a very, very simple vulnerability to understand, especially or in comparison to directory traversal. And you can now start to understand why I covered directory traversal vulnerabilities first before touching on local file inclusion, because most people jump to local file inclusion without understanding directory traversal. And when you understand traversal first in terms of order, LFI becomes a piece of cake, and the same goes for RFI. So the point is, again, when I execute a PHP script like login.php, it gets executed because PHP is executable on this web server because the backend or the server-side language is PHP. Now, if I try to load something like Python, if that has been configured to be executed, it will be executed. Otherwise, it'll just display the content. Now, in the context of what I was trying to show you earlier, where we can utilize traversal sequences or we can traverse directories to facilitate inclusion, in this particular case, we don't need to do that because it looks like we can include a resource that even includes a system file. But the point is, when I hit login.php, it includes it here in the context of the web application. I can also, again, use the example I'd used previously where I said, php info.php, and you can see that that is rendered. The PHP code is executed or included, if you will. So I know that the inclusion word can be a little bit confusing, but you don't need to, again, be worried about that. Now, you may be asking another question, and the question you may be asking is a valid question, and that is, what are the impacts of this specifically around remote code execution? And that is a very, very good question that you have asked, if indeed you have asked that question in your mind. Well, think of it from the perspective of an attacker who wants to maybe chain vulnerabilities. So let's say we combine arbitrary file upload with inclusion. Now, you may be saying, well, yeah, with arbitrary file upload, we can pretty much just access that particular URL or access where the PHP script was stored and it'll be executed. But what if you don't have access to that directory? Or what if the upload directory is private and is not publicly accessible, even if you have authenticated? Well, in that case, you can then leverage a local file inclusion vulnerability to include that particular shell that, let's say, you had uploaded and consequently execute it. And remember, you would be able to do this because it would now be operating under the context of the web server or the permissions of the web server and consequently the web application. So in that case, the point I'm trying to make is that that particular web shell would be executed or is accessible by www data, the user and the group, and it can pretty much execute it or execute anything within the context of the actual web application. So you can try that out for yourself as well. So if you take a look at arbitrary file uploads, so you go into missing access control, you can take a look at let's see, I believe we should have it here. We do not want vulnerable components. This should actually fall, there we are, unrestricted file upload. We'll click on hack. So in this case, it says, upload an image, but we could put a shell in there. Of course, in this case, the upload directory is publicly available, but you get the idea. Now, this becomes even more interesting when we talk about remote file inclusion, because remote file inclusion is where we do not need to chain these vulnerabilities. We can tell a web application, if it does have that functionality, we can tell it to include a remote resource, right? And the resource could be a shell that you are hosting on a web server. So you can sort of get an idea as to, what local file inclusion is all about and what the limitations are. And remote file inclusion, case in point, is very, very useful for RCE or remote code execution because of the fact that you can include remote files. With local file inclusion, you are limited to files stored locally on the server that's hosting the web application, either within the folder within the folder where the web application is stored, or even into the if you go, if you utilize traversal techniques, you can then also display or include system files, or any file that maybe contains some critical information. So it's really just the primary objective of this video was to show you the what it looks like, and then the obvious difference between directory traversal and local file inclusion, which you might have previously thought are the same thing. And I've actually seen this happen quite a lot, especially with students or beginners. They really think of it as the same type of vulnerability, but it isn't. And if you understand it, you'll be able to classify these vulnerabilities better, because there's nothing worse than classifying during a bug bounty report a local file inclusion vulnerability as directory traversal. It's not the same, because with inclusion, I have the ability to execute that and include it in the context of the web application or the current page that I'm on. So that's very, very important, or something that you need to be aware of. With that being said, now that we have this, tacit understanding as to what it looks like and what the outcome is, or what the potential impact is, that's going to conclude the practical demonstration side of this video, and it'll set the stage for what we'll be covering in the next video. So let me switch back over or conclude the practical section here. All right, so that was local file inclusion in a nutshell, and hopefully this practical foray into the vulnerability itself in terms of identification and exploitation gave you a better idea as to what it entails, and more importantly, you now understand the difference between the two big brothers or siblings, those being directory traversal vulnerabilities and of course local file inclusion vulnerabilities. This all sets the stage for what we'll be covering in the next video, which is going to be a practical demonstration on how to identify and exploit local file inclusion vulnerabilities in a real-world web application. With that being said, I'm sure you're excited, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.